Well, Trump is angering a lot of people, as per SOP, because it turns out that he is once again invoking what is actually his constitutional right as president of the United States to federalize law enforcement within D.C. Now, he says he is doing this in order to combat a growing crime spree. There's actually been a lot of high-profile assaults taking place in D.C. as of late. However, D.C. is hit back with, no, violent crime overall is down over 20%, and there's absolutely no need to do this. But what has really shocked a lot of people was that Trump hinted at the idea that the processes that he is using and that he is constitutionally authorized to use in D.C. right now may be extended to other cities which are dealing with crime. And this has got a lot of people speculating on whether or not Trump is vastly exceeding the authority he has as president of the United States. Well, in the meantime, many other people are cheering this on as the sort of thing that they voted for. We're going to discuss all of that and more from the multiple perspectives. We're going to take a look at the data, and we're going to come to our own conclusions about whether or not this is a constitutional action and an appropriate one given the situation on the ground. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas, back in the studio, and back with me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
We were gone to see our son, Luke, graduate from infantry training and is now going through Ranger assessment. So pray for Luke. Yeah. And then, of course, we have our resident historian, our political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, and first-time homeowner, just closed the deal today, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
You ruined it.
Oh,
the next episode was supposed to be the one where we reveal that I bought the house, not this one.
Oh, sorry. Well,
that's okay. We'll reveal it.
Forget everything I just said, and never mind. Christian doesn't have a home. In fact, I'm not even sure he's a citizen.
I'm homeless currently.
Is that better? Yeah.
Actually, we're taking applications for his future wife now.
That's right. Now that he's
got a place to put her.
Not the basement. She gets to be in the master bedroom. All right.
I'll tell you where I did not buy a house though.
Where?
Washington, D.C.
No. Why would you? One, it's unaffordable. And two, if it is affordable, it's probably crime-ridden. I've actually had people ask me, like, Nick, you spent a lot of time in D.C. How bad has it gotten? And I like to say, well, it's gotten so bad that I, Nick Freitas, a guy that believes that we should barely have a federal government, actually believes that the federal government taking over a city will make it safer and better. Like, that's where it's gotten. But look, there are some interesting statistics that have recently been put out with respect to what crime has been doing in D.C. as of late. And so we're going to go ahead and get to analyzing that. But before that, I want to make sure that we all understand that one of the ways that we research for all this is we use our good friends at Ground News. And in fact, we took a look at articles referencing Trump's takeover of D.C., or I should say maybe just federalization of the police. And we found right here on Ground News where it says Trump says he is deploying National Guard and federalizing D.C. police in crime-fighting effort. Now, one of the reasons why we like to use Ground News is because they give us a good breakdown of who is actually writing the articles, not to mention the fact giving you an overall analysis of the various comments and bullet points from the perspective of the left, center, and right. In fact, if you look over at their bias distribution, you can get a good handle on who all is writing about this and why, and all of that is incredibly important to understanding kind of the comprehensive view of the issue instead of just getting it from one perspective. Now, remember, Ground News is both a website and an app that curates all the latest stories and provides you with the insight into who is covering the news and why. So if, like us, you're a little tired of how other sites curate the news and want more transparency, go over to ground.news/MTA and you can get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's right, for just $5 a month. You can check out all of their many features and get unlimited access at ground.news/MTA. Again, the thing I love about this is all the news is curated. I can see the bias. I can see the overall analysis. I can see the various headlines. And then it gives me one spot to go to where I can look at this from multiple perspectives. So once again, ground.news/MTA. Go check it out. Okay, let's get into phase one of our analysis here, which is just the framing portion, right? We're going to take a look at what is going on and kind of try to get through all of the, there's a lot of commentary on what's actually taking place here. I mean, no less a source than Dan Carlin from Hardcore History thinks that we're entering into a new phase of American-esque Mussolini fascism. But what actually happened, right? Like what actually happened? So the first thing that we're going to do is going to go right to whitehouse.gov. And this is the president declaring a crime emergency in the District of Columbia. This is dated August 11th, 2025. And this is what it reads. By the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including Section 740 of the District of Columbia Self-Government and Governmental Reorganization Act, as amended, and Section 301 of Title III United States Code, it is hereby ordered that Section 1, crime is out of control in the District of Columbia. He goes through and lists out the various reasons why they think that crime is out of control. Scroll down a little bit more, and then it kind of goes over like some of the recent statistics. Section 2, it says services of Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia. This is where they talk about kind of the federalization of law enforcement. Operational control of the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia. This is, again, when you look at Section 40, he has complete constitutional authorization to do everything he's doing right here. So here's what we need to understand, is that the District of Columbia was set up as a federal city. And for the vast majority of its history, it was literally run and governed by Congress and the executive branch. They had different responsibilities within that process. Whereas, Congress could essentially make the rules with respect to how the city was governed, and then the executive branch was responsible for executing those rules, pretty much like how the federal Constitution works with respect to the division and the separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, in 1973, what happened is Congress passed basically a home rule provision. That's what Section 740 is. And they essentially said, okay, hey, look, we're going to allow the citizens of Washington, D.C. to elect their own city council, their own mayor, their own basically like local representatives. However, they're not going to get a voting member of Congress, and they're not going to get 2 senators. And Richard Nixon signed off on this. Now, within that provision was the recognition that while the federal government was allowing for home rule by the citizens of Washington, D.C., that did not fundamentally alter the nature of the District of Columbia. There was no constitutional amendment passed that essentially said, okay, federal government, this is no longer your jurisdiction. The mayor and the city council, they run. That is not what happened. You would have literally required a constitutional amendment in order to achieve that kind of power. What they did was essentially create kind of like a set aside. They said, look, we are saying that because we, as Congress and the president, have final authority over D.C., we are now going to allow D.C. to be able to elect a mayor, a city council, and to come up with their own provisions, city ordinances, things of that nature, right? But even within Section 740, it was acknowledged that the president and ultimately Congress still retain authority, right? This was not just a blanket approval for D.C. to be able to do whatever it wanted and to fundamentally alter the nature of the relationship between the District of Columbia and the federal government. And it's important to understand that because there's been a lot of hyperbolic language around, oh my gosh, this is a federal takeover. Okay, in one sense, that's true. But in another sense, they always had constitutional authority to do it. Right, there hasn't been a violation. So for the mayor of D.C. to come out and say, oh my gosh, this is unconstitutional. No, it isn't. Well,
I mean, the people, the citizens of that city are kind of an afterthought to be true. I mean,
well, wait a second. Look, we're kind of getting into, like on the framing portion, I mean, I get that you believe that, and I kind of believe that too, but.
Well, my point is that when it was set up, it was set up for a certain purpose, and then these other things sort of happened after that thing. So
what do you mean?
It's not like you had a ton of people that had settled there and it was their town first or their city first, and then they allowed the federal government to come in there.
Yeah.
The federal government basically created this city.
Yeah. It was more or less a swamp.
Yeah.
At the start of it, right?
Yeah. And when we say it was a swamp, we mean figuratively and literally.
People actually making it their long-term home wasn't really what it was for.
Well, I think it's also important to understand that you've seen a lot of people that they've requested D.C. statehood and they want senators.
Right.
That is purely a power grab. D.C. was always established as a federal city. It was basically established to facilitate the functioning of the federal government, and it was intentionally not given the same sort of status as a state or even cities within a state because they didn't want to create that sort of environment. The states would have been very, very opposed to that sort of arrangement because you would have essentially had a federal city having equal powers with states. And so a lot of times they will complain that, oh, well, we have taxation without representation because we got to pay federal taxes, but we don't have representation in Congress. tough.
Yeah.
That's how the federal city was
never
always
meant to be that
established.
way.
You chose to live there. You chose to move there. You've now been given more authority to govern yourselves than was ever intended by the Constitution.
And most of the people there aren't even natives to the area. So
And on that front, I think that the experiment has kind of played itself out, and we now know that, quite frankly, Washington, D.C. is not capable of governing itself. Like,
Well-
there's the evidence, I think, is just overwhelming at this point. That, I mean, we can go back to like Marion Barry in the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah. How many
And-
times did he
and-
get arrested for cocaine?
Like,
And then get reelected.
as proof of the argument here, that I don't think DC is capable of ruling itself. And so, like you said at the start of this podcast, like, this might be the one instance where the government coming in and taking control of something might actually produce a better outcome.
well,
if
and
there's-
because it was originally set up that way.
If there's ever an example where that argument can be true, it's in Washington, D.C., in large part because until the 1970s, Congress ran D.C., the presidency ran D.C. The president was effectively the governor of D.C.,
Yeah.
and Congress was effectively the state legislature for D.C. until they enacted home rule. And look at what's happened to the city since they enacted home rule. D.C. was, like, at one point in time, D.C. was the murder capital of the entire United States. It still is, to this day, one of the most violent cities in America.
Well, let's get into this part too, because there's a couple of the things that happen here that, again, if we're going to be fair, we have a right to, if we're going to be fair, I understand the concerns that some people are doing. Now, I don't necessarily agree with Dan Carlin, but there's two other things that happen. One, he deployed the National Guard, which, again, he has complete authority to do, right? There's nothing unconstitutional about the president deploying the National Guard. Now, why did he do this? Well, there have been a series of very high-profile attacks, and some of those attacks have been specifically directed toward either members of the Trump administration, former members of the Trump administration, staffers. And by the way, it hasn't just been on the right. It was interesting how there was this story about this one congresswoman who, if I remember correctly, had been one of the advocates for like defund the police, who got carjacked in D.C. Interestingly enough, I understand she called the police when she got carjacked. That sounds strange, but that's what happened. But the whole bringing in the National Guard as well, it does create this image in people's minds of, okay, you federalize the police, but you're bringing in the National Guard as well. Is that justified based off of the crime statistics? The third component here, which really raised a lot of eyebrows, which, if I'm being honest, mine as well, was Trump didn't just talk about D.C. Now, there's two things that we're talking about here for framing. One is, does Trump have constitutional authority to do what he's doing in D.C.? Yes. That's really, it's just not very debatable unless you're willing to completely throw out Article Section 40 and the Constitution when it comes to the management of D.C. He has the authority to do what he's doing. Should he do it, or should he basically defer to home rule? Right? The whole reason why we have home rule in D.C. is because Americans in general believe that you should have representation, and that I think it was Jefferson that said that maybe it wasn't Jefferson, but it was this whole idea that you want government as close to the people as possible. That's one of the reasons why when we look at our separation of powers and the tradition within the United States, it's not just between Congress and the president and the judiciary. It's also between the federal government and the states. And then even when you go down to the states, the vast majority of states have what they call home rule laws, which is to say that the state constitution is supreme within that state. However, insofar as the Constitution is silent on a particular issue, local jurisdictions have the right to create ordinances and organize things in a way that works best for that locality. And Americans in general, that appeals to us. I don't want the federal government deciding what my local, speed limits are in my town, right? Like, I don't want them deciding what roads we're going to pay, right? I want those to be local decisions. That makes sense. It's part of the reason why home rule in D.C. made sense to so many people, and it was generally a bipartisan decision. But then Trump started talking about, it's not just D.C. It's Los Angeles, it's Chicago, it's New York, it's Oakland, it's Baltimore. And guess what? He's not wrong. The crime issues that D.C. is facing right now are not unique to D.C. What's unique about D.C. is its kind of a relationship with the federal government. There is no constitutional authorization for a president to say, crime is bad in Los Angeles, therefore I'm going to federalize law enforcement in Los Angeles. And Trump made it sound like D.C. was just the start. right? So he lists off all these others. Now, he did not say, I'm going to federalize law enforcement in Los Angeles or New York, at least not from what I saw.
No,
I
he just
have
said
the
we're going to
clip if you
clean
wanna
that up
listen to
too.
it.
We're going to clean them all
Okay,
up.
let's take a look at this.
It is. We have other cities that are very bad. New York has a problem. And then you have, of course, Baltimore and Oakland. We don't even mention that anymore. They're so far gone. We're not going to let it happen. We're not going to lose our cities over this. And this will go further. We're starting very strongly with D.C., and we're going to clean it up real quick.
Okay, pause that.
Very quickly, as they say. It is.
This is the part where, again, now we're talking about outside the typical boundaries of presidential authority when it comes to dealing with crime in other cities, which fall within the jurisdiction of those states or those cities. And so I think that's kind of a good comprehensive framing of what we're actually talking about. We're talking about what's going on in DC, whether or not it's justified based off of the crime statistics. He has the authority to do it. And then does this translate into assuming federal authority or some other mechanism for maybe bringing down crime or dealing with some of the issues that we see in places like San Francisco, where it's not just crime, but it might be like rampant homelessness,
Well,
rampant drug use,
we
things
did
like
see
that.
during the most recent LA unrest and riots and everything, Trump did say he was calling up the National Guard for it, and he was going to go in and take care of business.
Well, there is
So the question is. So I think it's not too far of a stretch to think maybe he does have something in his back pocket for those cities too, and that's what he's alluding to.
And it may be. Ben Shapiro once said, "I take Trump seriously. I don't always take him literally." And I actually think that's a good call, because sometimes Trump says something in order to frame things for himself. He will hint at something that will basically drive people toward action, and then he will respond accordingly. Does the president have the authority to bring in the National Guard to put in insurrections? Yes, right. That falls under
The Insurrection Act.
The Insurrection Act and the Constitution. You've seen it exercised by George Bush during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. You recently saw it exercised by Donald Trump when it came to what was going on with ICE enforcement in Los Angeles. So there is a precedent for it. There's a history of it being used. That is the reason why the Insurrection Act exists. However, there usually has to be such a loss of control at the local level as to justify that sort of federal intervention. Because there can always be legal debates on, well, does this constitute insurrection or does this constitute? But a large part of what allows it to be politically acceptable and therefore legally acceptable is whether or not the people watching what's going on in a particular city have become so incensed by it that they're saying, yeah, something has to be done.
I also kind of wonder if there is a possibility that he thinks it's going to go so well in DC that other areas will reach out and want help to fix that. And he might be willing to provide that help or guidance. It might set an example, and people are going to clamor for the peace and tranquility that now exists in DC in their big city. And so it could be that he's hitting this from multiple angles.
It could be. And that kind of drives us into, let's go ahead and take a look at this from the perspective of the left and the perspective of the right. Now we're going to start from the perspective of the left. And here's my job in this role. My job is to give the best argument possible from the left-wing perspective. So we're going to go through some of their comments and their statements. And then we'll kind of give okay, what is the left-wing argument here? So I mean, obviously, when you got Dan Carlin is not someone I would describe as being necessarily left wing, but he's certainly articulating.
Oh, the mask has slipped, I think.
Yeah, he's saying, those of you who don't know what authoritarianism looks like, this is it. All the gaslighting about previous presidents, what about, is BS. I've been talking about the slide towards now for 30 plus years. Those earlier concerns were nothing. Now we are here. And this isn't partisan. This is the time for choosing, which is a reference to Ronald Reagan's Ronald Reagan's 1964 Time for Choosing speech. Do you support the constitutional republic or this one person, this one malformed, narcissistic, completely non-empathetic except for himself version of an American wannabe Mussolini, because that's what this guy is. And here's the rub. If you don't see it, it's either because you are so blinded by your own partisanship, brainwashing, or sunk cognitive dissonance costs, or it's because these are things you wanted all along. Hashtag un-American.
Hang on. Let me quote this and say I wanted this all along.
You can say with all their presidents this or that, but none have come close to doing all this. You take the most extreme things previous presidents have done, the single most, and Trump combines those most extreme single things in this long list of most extreme things. Gaslight yourself till you're blue in the face. I'm a person who knows his history. We've never had anything like this, and this is exactly what the founders worried about. It's been a multi-decade slide to get here, but we're here. Everyone who is honest with themselves knows it.
So there's a lot to unpack here, but I'm going to begin with, I never want to hear a liberal ever invoke the founding fathers of the Constitution ever again. Those arguments are totally dead for them.
Well, wait a second. We're still on the left's perspective. We're going to get to our analysis of all this, right? But
I'm just saying it is exceedingly disingenuous after 2020
sure.
and everything that happened post 2020 for these people to be invoking the very people that they decried as white supremacist, patriarchal slave owners, and the document that they decried as outdated, a tool of white supremacy written by again, like they delegitimized these documents over and over again to justify what? Their political agenda. And now they're invoking these things to do what? Defend their political agenda.
Well,
and you know what?
And it doesn't even defend. I mean,
for him to go out there and say no other president has done this before. It was not Donald Trump's administration that tried to throw a previous president in prison, that raided his house, that brought him up on bogus charges, that amended retroactively the laws in the state of New York in order to allow him to be charged, that then tried to throw him off the ballot in multiple states to prevent him from running again. That all happened under the Democrats with Joe Biden.
Well, I think the other thing too is Dan Carlin, puts himself out there as a historian, and what is it? Hardcore History of Dan Carlin is an incredibly popular site. I've listened to some of his stuff on there, and thought that generally speaking, it's been interesting. But the other thing too that's a little bit interesting about what he's saying here, like this has never been done before. Has he not read anything about the history of Woodrow Wilson during the First World War? I mean, Woodrow Wilson was throwing journalists in jail.
It would be, it's strange for somebody that is big on history to ignore history in this sense.
Well, and it's like FDR. FDR literally rounded up tens of thousands of Japanese citizens, many of whom have actually had family members fighting in the United States Army against Imperial Japan. In fact, one of the most decorated units.
Well, they weren't fighting against the Japanese. We sent them to the European front. Yeah,
sure. But the other thing too to keep in mind though is that that was one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Right? Was this unit that was made up of Japanese Americans, some of whom had parents in internment camps. So this idea that anything Trump has done at this phase is somehow just proto-fascism. Suggests to me that Dan Carlin doesn't know his own history as well as he thinks he does. That doesn't mean he hasn't made interesting historical points, but it's a little bit ridiculous to be making the argument that he is now, that the federalization of law enforcement in D.C., which is entirely constitutional, is somehow a repudiation of everything dear to Americans, completely un-American, and the only way that you could be supportive of it is through cognitive dissonance or partisanship. There's another thing too. There was another link you put up to they compare this to the Reichstag fire 2.0. Christian, give us a little bit of background on when they say Reichstag fire. What are they referring to?
So the Reichstag fire is kind of used as not an analogy, but it's used as an example of one of the power grabs that the Nazis implemented to take control over Germany. So Hitler gets appointed chancellor in 1933, and then it was just a few months later, basically a month later, that the Reichstag building, which was their parliamentary building, caught on fire. Who set the fire is something that we still debate today.
Yeah.
But the Nazis found a communist that they blamed for the fire, and they arrested, and then they used the act of arson that they argued took place to justify emergency powers. They had President Hindenburg basically suspend most civil liberties and hand the country over to the chancellor, who was Hitler at the time. Mm-hmm. And so the Reichstag fire has since become used as it's usually employed as an idea that there's this false flag that's used to allow the state to accumulate vast powers that it otherwise would not use in order to suppress dissidents. Whether or not the Nazis were the ones that actually set fire, we don't know historically, but we do know that they certainly used it as a justification.
Became a catalyst for essentially eroding the German Republic and bringing in the Third Reich.
You could argue that it was a combination of the Reichstag fire and certainly the Enabling Act that permanently put an end to the Weimar Republic.
And we've talked about this before as we've looked at things within the United States right now and current troubles. Like, what would it take for us to actually have a second World War or excuse me, a second Civil War or a second insurrection, like sizable insurrection in the United States? And we always talk about conditions and a catalyst. And essentially what they're saying is that the conditions that led to the catalyst, that was the Reichstag fire, is essentially now, unveiling right before our eyes right now. And so what they're saying is the conditions in the United States is we've never been more divided, and we have this, super populist style, kind of strongman president who is exercising federal authority in a way that we're just not accustomed to. And the catalyst of crime in D.C., and specifically some of the more high-profile crimes directed at maybe members of the Trump administration or members of Doge, that is what is fueling this latest takeover, and that this is going to essentially usher in the same thing that the Nazis ushered in. Right?
Always 1933 with these people.
Well, but part of the reason why the left says that is because of the recent crime statistics that were put out by the Metropolitan Police Department in D.C. And if you look at this, what they're essentially saying is, this comes from Mayor Muriel Bowser, Washington, D.C. is a beautiful city. D.C. is home to 700,000 people and welcomes millions every year. We have the #1 park system, fantastic public schools, and a tremendous public transportation system. And we are at a 30-year low in violent crimes. It's important for all of you who live here and visit to know how beautiful our city is and how proud we are of all of that.
Look at this ratio that she's getting right now.
Well, wait a second. Before we go to that, I do want to say, I looked up the crime stats that were put out by Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, and what they show, all right, is between the 2024 and 2025, they've got a 12% decrease in homicide, 50% decrease in sexual abuse, 20% decrease in assault with a dangerous weapon, 28% decrease in robbery, 26% overall decrease in violent crime, and a 4% decrease in property crime. All crime total is a 7% decrease. So from their perspective, what they're saying is that the latest data that they have is actually showing that law enforcement in D.C., they're not saying that D.C. doesn't have crime issues. The left is simply saying that if you actually look at the trend that's taking place in D.C., it's actually on a downturn. And why would you now? Their argument. So here's me giving the left-wing argument as faithfully as I can. All right, and their argument is this. Yes, D.C. has a crime issue, and yes, the federal government does have certain jurisdiction over D.C. However, we have recognized in 1973 with the Home Rule Act that essentially people should have a right to be able to govern themselves. And the people in D.C. are already living at a disadvantage because they don't have representation in the federal government, despite the fact that they still have to pay federal taxes. This is why their little official license plate says taxation without representation. Recognizing this problem, Congress, with the president's approval, gave D.C. the ability to engage in home rule, to have a city council, to have their school boards, to have their mayor, to be able to arrange themselves and set up the proper ordinances and run their police department in accordance with the will of the people living in D.C. And while there's been ups and downs, just like there has been in every major metropolitan city within the country, the latest crime statistics suggest that D.C. is doing at least a much better job than it had been in the past. Things are getting better. And so therefore, the idea that President Trump now would assert this kind of authority while mentioning other cities for which he has no federal jurisdiction represents a major issue. Because what it suggests is the justification that he is using to federalize D.C. law enforcement is not warranted based off of the crime statistics. Therefore, we should come to the conclusion that he actually has a different incentive structure. It's not about returning law and order to D.C., which is actually getting better, right? It's about him wanting to use federal authority to go in and punish blue cities that are not doing what he thinks they should do. He thinks they should be more actively working with ICE. He thinks they should be more actively supporting his presidency. He thinks that they represent resistance toward his presidency. And so what he's doing in D.C. is setting a precedent. right? From the left's perspective, what this is don't you guys see what's going on here? He's already threatening to vastly exceed his constitutional authority by cracking down on other cities. And isn't it a coincidence that he's attacking the cities that don't agree with his agenda? So what he's using is federal authority to punish his political opponents. And then the left says, but if you look at the Constitution, if you look at American traditions, if you look at what people voted for President Trump for, it was to rein in the federal government's authority. It was to actually return to a degree of federalism. And now Donald Trump is essentially hinting that he's going to do the same. So the reason why the left is warning all of you who claim to care about the Constitution, who claim to care about home rule, who claim to care about government closest to the people, is Trump is not doing this to get DC under wraps. Because the crime statistics, according to them, show that it's already moving in a positive direction. No, he's doing this to test the waters. He's doing this because if he can come back later and use the bully pulpit to exclaim, DC was crap until Donald Trump stepped in and did something about it, and I can do the same thing for your cities as well. So just kind of ignore that I don't have constitutional authority to do this in Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland, Los Angeles, Chicago. Look how well it worked in DC. And if you accept that, well, then understand you're accepting it for every president, not just for the one you like. That is the most faithful interpretation of the left-wing perspective that I can provide. And I think if anybody on the left were to hear that argument outside of knowing who I am or knowing, that the show is definitely more conservative and libertarian in some respects, I think if they just heard that argument, they'd say, yes, that's exactly what we're saying. That's exactly what we're saying. But now let's go into the right-wing perspective. And speaking of things that you voted for, one of the things I know I voted for was the defunding of Planned Parenthood. And that's why I want to thank Live Action, because Live Action has actually been critical in fighting to protect and to defend innocent human life. And they've not only been great about it on the political scene, they've been great on the cultural front. Their views on social media, the videos they do, the posts they do, the interviews they do, they get about 40 million views per month. And out of the 8 million plus followers that they have, about 47% of them polled have come back and said, yes, something that Live Action did changed the way I viewed abortion. Now, as happy as we all are that our tax dollars are no longer going to an industry, no longer going to a business like Planned Parenthood that deliberately kills the innocent, using our tax dollars against our will in order to do it, as excited as we are about that going away for 1 year, it only went away for 1 year. They're going to be fighting incredibly hard to get that back into the budget next year. And it's our job to make sure that they can't do it. And Live Action is on the forefront to making sure that we continue to make the good arguments both to Congress and to the culture in general on why we need to protect and uphold and support innocent human life. Now, I want to let you in on a special offer right now. If you would like to join the movement, if you would like to donate to Live Action, $20.25 a month. That's all it takes. $20.25 a month. They're going to send you your handy dandy Live Action Save the Babies mug. Plus, you're going to be helping an organization that has maximized their efforts in protecting innocent human life. How do you do all of this? Very simple. You text NICK, that's NICK, to 70723. Text NICK to 70723. Let Live Action know that you appreciate them supporting this show, but most of all, you support them protecting innocent human life. All right, let's move on to the right-wing perspective on all of this. So I guess the first thing that we have to ask ourselves, if we look at the left-wing perspective, which is we don't buy your argument, Trump, because crime is falling in D.C. Things are getting significantly better. When you've cut violent crime by 26% in 1 year, why is now the time to deploy the National Guard? I know
this
why.
This might be the reason.
Because you had the D.C. police a D.C. police commander suspended, accused of changing crime statistics. You know what, Christian? I bet he was accused by Heritage Foundation. I bet he was accused by the Trump administration. Was it Doge? Did Doge accuse the D.C. commander of fudging the numbers? Oh, wait, no, it was the police union.
The police union has accused the department of deliberately falsifying crime data. So,
according to 3 law enforcement sources familiar with the complaint.
You know what's so funny about this story?
What?
Even if this wasn't happening, and this is a huge scandal going on right now. Like, this was going on for a few weeks before Trump's announcement. In fact, one could argue this might have triggered Trump's announcement. Even if you take this aside, though, for a second, when the mayor of D.C. was going out there saying crime's at a 30-year low, if Washington, D.C., if the Democrats got their way and Washington, D.C. was made a state tomorrow, it would have the number one highest murder rate of any state in the country. After her supposed 30-year low in violent crime.
So even if you do buy the numbers, it would still be the most violent, the highest murder.
They would
rate.
easily have the highest murder rate of any state in the country.
Yeah. I mean,
so what an incredible self-own this is. Violent crime is at a 30-year low. Yeah, and compared to every other state in the country, you have the number one murder rate of the entire nation.
Well, and what they would say is it's not.
Oh,
a fair
and
comparison.
you're also lying about it too.
Yeah.
It turns out that stat's just not even true. That's the bigger thing is that it would be one thing if they were saying it by mistake and that they didn't realize that oh, well, maybe these numbers are a little off. No, they're all complicit. They see that it helps their argument. It helps them to fudge these numbers. So it's actually much more nefarious than a mistake.
Yeah. So here's.
I just had to bring that up because it totally defeats their own crime's at a 30-year low, and yet the murder rate is still higher than anywhere else in the country.
Well, what's that? It's not.
And
higher,
you're
okay.
lying about the statistics.
Let's be honest. It's not higher than anywhere else in the country. It would be higher if we compared it to other states.
Other states, yes.
If DC, and again, most people would look at that and say, well, that's not fair. You're comparing a city to a state. Well, again, DC is advocating for statehood for itself, essentially. So now you do get to be compared to other states. But let's look at it this way directly. So the White House actually was addressing this. They said in 2024, Washington, D.C. saw a homicide rate of 27.3 per 100,000 residents. That was the fourth highest homicide rate in the country, nearly 6 times higher than New York City and also higher than Atlanta, Chicago, and Compton. And if Washington, D.C. was a state, it would have the highest homicide rate of any state in the nation. In 2012, the homicide rate in D.C. was just 13.9 per 100,000 residents. The other thing they go on to say is Washington, D.C.'s murder rate is roughly 3 times higher than that of Islamabad, Pakistan, and 18 times higher than that of communist-run Havana, Cuba. I will say that's one thing about homicide rates in communist countries is that if the government isn't killing you, they actually maintain law and order. The number of juveniles arrested in D.C. has gone up each year since 2020, many of whom have had prior arrests for violent crimes. There were 29,348 crimes reported in Washington, D.C. last year, including 3,469 violent offenses, 1,026 assaults with a dangerous weapon, 2,113 robberies, and 5,139 motor vehicle thefts. So far in 2025, there have already been nearly 1,600 violent crimes and nearly 16,000 total crimes reported in Washington, D.C. So again, he's making the argument. Now, what you could come back and say is, well, yeah, but you're saying that there's a lot of crime. Okay, but if it's getting better, why stop? And again, that's the important part to look at, is that when we can't trust the crime statistics, and let's keep something in mind. The police union lobbied a accusation that DC was falsifying their crime statistics. Now, why would the police union be interested in exposing corruption within crime statistics? Well, when the union has the incentive to essentially say, look, our officers are dealing with a very difficult situation. It's very violent. It's very dangerous. Therefore, they deserve compensation. So it could be pay raises. It could be mental health considerations. It could be more time off, right? So
or hiring more officers.
Right? The police union, their incentive structure is to advocate on behalf of their officers, of their union members. So again, their interest is in making the case that no, DC is not quite as hunky-dory as you're making it out to be. But it's important to understand that incentive structure as well. Here's the part that becomes so frustrating. And we've seen this in Virginia as well, where you've got the Commonwealth attorney in Fairfax County constantly saying, oh, violent crime is down or crime overall is down. But then you always have to pour a little bit more into the statistics. How do you measure crime? So whenever you're looking at crime stats, you need to look at how are you measuring it. And again, when Trump points out that, okay, Washington, D.C. has a higher murder rate than Bogota, Mexico City, Islamabad, Lima, Peru, Ottawa, Paris, and he's going through other major capital cities, it's hard to argue that there isn't a problem here. And it's hard to argue that there isn't a problem that DC is failing to deal with, because you can manipulate statistics. One of the ways that you manipulate statistics is looking at felonies. One of the things that liberal jurisdictions have done is they've changed felonies into misdemeanors. And they've done this with things like theft.
And they've allowed for expunging many
Yes.
misdemeanors.
So they've allowed for expunging misdemeanors. They refuse to prosecute certain misdemeanors. They've taken things that were previous felonies and made them misdemeanors. And look, we can all have an argument on what we think is good or bad on that. There was a bill in Virginia a while back that got bipartisan support that increased the threshold for felony theft. Now, the compromise is we wanted restitution for victims to be paid before people could just be arbitrarily released. We wanted victims to be made whole. But the argument is that, well, with inflation going up, if you stole like one iPhone, that's now a felony. Should that be a felony? Now, again, we can argue all day long on whether or not it should or should not be. The problem is that what ends up happening is you can now claim that you have, quote, less crime when you don't have less crime, right? You actually have the same amount of crime or even maybe more crime, but since it's not tracked as a felony, you can say, oh, our felonies are down. Okay, well, that's manipulation of statistics. Because what people think when you say crime is down is they think less crime is happening, not that you change the category of crime, right? And are now claiming that, oh, well, because now these 1,000 different instances of theft are no longer considered felony, we can say felony theft is down. That's not an accurate representation of what people think in their minds when you're saying that your crime is improving. And again, the other thing that you have to look at, and some of this is more difficult to identify, right? So when you say that sex abuse is down 50% from 2024, and this, I'm looking right now at the Metropolitan Police Department, DC.gov statistics. Okay, great, but you're comparing 2024 to 2025. Now, I presume that what you're comparing is up to this date, up to this point in 2024 versus 2025. But then I would have to look deeper into the numbers. And I'm going to admit right now I haven't, right? So I'm not making an absolute claim here. I'm saying that the way that we look at statistics, unless you really dig into the numbers for everything, you can get, again, it's not like they gave me a link here to check into the numbers, right? They're giving me an Excel spreadsheet to look at. What do you consider sex abuse now? Like if you file fewer complaints, or if you choose to charge people less, I can manipulate my own statistics to make things look safer than they actually are. When liberal or left-wing or progressive criminal justice reform prosecutors choose to prosecute less, that impacts my crime statistics in a way that can be manipulated to look like, oh, things are getting better. When in reality, it's like, no, you got fewer convictions because you prosecuted less, right? Or here's the other thing that happens, which is much more difficult to capture. When for instance, in Virginia, we've had Commonwealth attorneys say, I will not prosecute X. I will not prosecute it. Well, law enforcement looks at that and is like, okay, then why do I bother? Well, if I don't get arrests associated with it, or I don't answer, or I don't prioritize calls associated with something, then I'm going to get theoretically fewer instances. Not because fewer crimes took place, but because you set the precedent that you're no longer going to prosecute these things. So why spend the time and resources trying to, follow it up with police reports? These things all need to be taken into consideration, because here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm seriously skeptical that the same, so here's what we're being asked to believe. The same sort of city council, the same sort of mayor, the same sort of progressive, attorneys and everything else somehow managed to facilitate a 26% drop in overall violent crime. What did you do different? What did you please, like, can you show me what you did different to facilitate this? And if the answer is, oh, it just kind of happened. Well, it really, because it wasn't happening before. So what changed? And that's where from the right, we look at this with a healthy degree of skepticism. It's like, well, I've seen what you did in places like San Francisco. I've seen what you've done in other cities where you've just changed the way that you gather the statistics. And here's the bottom line, is that doesn't help the person that is more likely to be a victim of violent crime.
We need justice for big balls.
All right, so
for
anyone that is not aware, that is the moniker given to a member of the Doge team, and he actually intervened on a woman being carjacked. So he actually did something from all accounts. he did something very, very brave. He decided to intervene. It's not like he's a big dude or something like that. He decided to intervene in order to help a woman that was being carjacked. From what I understand, he actually helped prevent her from being carjacked. But
And
he
he
got
got roughed
brutalized. Like, you look at this dude, he's dripping blood. But this guy, this 19-year-old former Doge worker, goes in there, breaks up a carjacking from, I guess it was two 15-year-old suspects. And they beat him pretty bad. I think he had a concussion, multiple abrasions. But this is part of these are the sort of stories that elevate right now.
We're seeing videos like of people just getting completely brutalized by groups.
Yeah.
We have, I mean, it's one thing when you've got like one person that like mugged another person, but instead you have these roving groups of people going around and just brutalizing singular people. And so like a whole horde of people is now beating the crud out of one person, like stomping women's faces into the ground and things like that.
So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give the right wing analysis on this, and I'm not just going to give kind of the right in general. I'm actually going to go more toward like what Michael Knowles recently said on his program, because Michael Knowles has said that we've actually talked about there's a difference between conservative and MAGA. And so one of the things Knowles has said is, not only am I happy about Trump doing this in D.C., I absolutely think he should do it in other crime-ridden cities like Baltimore, right? And I don't think I'm putting words into Michael's mouth, and I consider Michael a great guy. I enjoy his commentary very much. So if I have overstated it, Michael, please correct me. But when I was watching his stuff, he was like, no, this is what is kind of associated with what they call one nation conservatism. And he kind of referenced back to like Disraeli who was the Prime Minister of England. It's this idea that conservatism is not just about maintaining and protecting processes. It's about actually using power to achieve desirable conservative end states. One of those desirable conservative end states is law and order. And if a city refuses to get itself under control, then somebody like President Trump using power in order to get those cities under control is perfectly consistent with why he was elected and the overall MAGA movement. But that kind of flies in the face of certain aspects of conservatism, which says that no, American conservatism is about protecting the constitutional order and structure of things. But here's what I interpret as the right-wing argument for what Trump's doing and to potentially expand what he's doing in other cities. It's like, look, we've been through this before. Yes, we gave you home rule, and what did you do with it? You screwed it up. You turned what should be one of the most safest, most beautiful cities, the Paris of the West, you turned it into a crime-ridden slum. And the only place that you actually effectively protect is the Capitol building itself and the mall, and even those places are becoming more dangerous. So you don't get to maintain the protection of Washington, D.C. anymore. And I hope Trump not only cracks down on crime, I hope he cracks down on the slums and everything else, because we're tired of our capital city turning into a joke. And oh, by the way, if he decides to use authority to go into places like Baltimore and Detroit and Los Angeles and Seattle, and you know what these cities all have in common? They have all consistently voted for progressive left-wing politicians for at least the last 6 decades. And they have turned what should be a beautiful American cities into crap holes. Crap holes where good, honest, hardworking Americans are afraid to take their kids to school, are afraid to visit parks, because you've turned them into slums. You've turned them into places where you have intravenous drug use going on in broad daylight. You throw your needles on the ground. You allow homeless encampments in proximity of elementary schools. You waste billions of dollars solving homelessness to only have it increase under your watch. So clearly, not only are you incapable of managing the cities, but the people that voted you in are incapable of making the sort of decisions, the sort of rational decisions that would lead to the policy changes that could actually make your places safe. So guess what? This is what some of the right wing, you lose the right of home rule. Because here's what also happens when you let your cities become cesspools. It impacts the rest of your state and the rest of the country. Because what's the first thing that you do? You beg for federal subsidies. You beg for federal funding. You manipulate the census. You allow yourself to have more representation in Congress than you should have because of things like illegal immigration. And then you use that additional power to grant yourself more federal subsidization of welfare programs, of community action programs. And then what do? then you take that funding that you've gotten, not just from the state, not just from your city, not just from your citizens, but from us, and you fuel it into non-governmental organizations, NGOs, staffed by your friends that give you campaign contributions to turn your cities into even bigger crap holes. So guess what? We're tired of it. You don't get it anymore. You don't get the benefit of the doubt. And this is a element within the MAGA movement that is saying, if you want strong representative government with limited government, then you know what you need? High trust societies that actually behave in reasonable, logical, and rational ways. And you don't. You use these little cities as a way to set up various constituencies that are dependent on political patronage and federal funds in order to maintain power. And you don't do anything to actually do what would be necessary to clean up your own streets. So if you're not going to do it, but you're going to insist on taking my tax dollars, well, then we're going to let somebody who is willing to do what's necessary, which is A, increase law enforcement presence, go after criminals, arrest them, prosecute them, give them due process of law. But then when they get in jail, guess what? They stay there. They don't get let out on some sort of progressive policy of sentence credits. No, they stay in jail. Why? Because when you have demonstrated over and over and over again that you're not willing to live in peace with your fellow Americans, then guess what? You get to go to a special place where you can be a criminal. You just don't get to impact law-abiding citizens. And if Trump is willing to do that, well, then by God, let him. And I'm tired of hearing these constructionist arguments that, oh, well, but if we do it, what'll happen to us? It's already been happening to us. If this is the way the system's going to be run, we might as well get some benefits from it when our guy's in power. That's the right-wing argument for Trump not only doing what he's doing in D.C., but to expand it in other areas for which he does not have constitutional authority, but may try to suggest that he does under things like the Insurrection Act.
I was about to say, Nick, I'm sold.
In other words, yes, I did vote for this.
Yeah. So this is where we get into our analysis now, right? Where we look at the left-wing arguments, the right-wing, some of the MAGA arguments. Maybe, again, I'm not saying that what I just said is what Michael Knowles would say, but Michael Knowles did make an argument that, look, we're tired of this atomized version of conservatism where conservatives are never allowed to use power because what if it got used against us? Well, it already has been. So we might as well use it back in order to affect some positive change and not just protect the Constitution in the sense that what I think they're arguing is we don't want to just protect the stringent nature of the Constitution as a legal document. We want to protect the American way of life. That the Constitution was written, as John Adams said, for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to the government of any other. Well, guess what? These cities have proven that they are not the sort of places that appreciate the Constitution, and maybe they should no longer get the benefits of, a society so free that it allows them to essentially destroy themselves. That's what I think their argument is.
Yeah.
Now we're going to get into our analysis.
We're done letting them impose their dysfunction on us. When we're seeing videos constantly of people getting curb stomped and people going into, retail places and just taking out armloads of stuff and just beating up whoever gets in their way. When you've got people just can't even walk from a restaurant to their car without getting brutalized.
So if we all ignore, well, let me push back because I want both of you to opine on this.
No, we're past the pushback part.
Well, no. What I mean by pushback is
we get to say what we want.
You have argued. Okay, Look, this is what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to do the whole left wing thing, whereas I'm going to list off a lot of bad stuff, and they're saying it justifies my actions. I want you to specify what do you think? Do you think Trump should actually not only do what he's doing in D.C. I think all three of us are in agreement that he has complete constitutional authority, and I believe it's justified. I believe what he's doing is justified. I also believe I can't believe Nick Freitas is saying this, but D.C.'s gotten so bad that the federal government taking it over will make it better and safer, right? I said this at the beginning. But I think that's what's going to happen. I think within 6 months, you're going to see such a change in D.C. that people are going to look at that and be like, well, that worked. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that the left they're going to ship in protesters. They're going to have paid protesters. Soros money is going to go into DC and activists like you would not believe. They're going to have they're going to try. They're going to try to prove that Trump screwed up DC, that Trump's solution was worse than the problem because they're going to pay people to riot and burn things down in DC. I'm going to predict this right now.
The thing is that the more they do that, though, the more your regular people look at that and just go, I'm done with this garbage.
So the question is do you think, Tina, is it your opinion that not only should Trump do what he's doing in D.C. and double down, like make sure he does it, like knowing, because I'm assuming we all believe that the left is going to respond to this with riots and violence, because they're going to try to prove that Trump's solution is worse than the problem, that he basically exacerbated the situation. Trump should double down in D.C. I think we're all agreed on that. But should he then export this to other cities? And what would be his process for doing so? Should he do it? And if he should, how?
The answer is yes and yes. And the question of how is the only thing I can't tell you. I can't say, I don't think he can do this I think he can perfectly fine do this in DC. He's within constitutional parameters to do so. He's going to have to get more creative with how he goes about it for anywhere else.
Okay.
And so he's going to have to get compliance in some way. However, I think most of us are really finished with all of the arguments from the left. I mean, after 2020 and they locked everybody down and they were arresting people for going to parks with their kids, when they were, turning neighbors in and things like that, I think we're all pretty much done giving the left any wiggle room on this. It's like, look, you were going to freaking jail me for not wearing a mask or jail me for going somewhere during lockdowns. I'm going to jail you for robbing somebody and beating them up. I'm done with all of that. And I'm done playing nice with this stuff. There are a lot of people in this country that do deserve to be locked up. And I'm completely 100% okay with the whatever to jail pipelines. Okay, please, let's pipeline some more. Let's usher them in there. Maybe if jails sucked, maybe if they were having to do some hard labor and jail actually sucked, we don't get cable. You don't get to sit here and exercise. You don't get any of that. You get to sit in your freaking cell by yourself.
You get to exercise in the form of
and you'll get
farming crops.
I'll give you a freaking peanut butter and jelly sandwich
to sustain the food of the prison.
I was about to say,
I literally do not care what they get fed. I want them to just subsist. I don't want anyone having the ability to build muscle or strength or fat or anything in prison. Prison should suck. You should rather die than go to prison.
So,
wait, real quick. I want to tool something up for you. So Tina has definitely given the, hell and brimfire. And I think most of us agree. We said this early on, Christian, you mentioned this. I'm done hearing the left's arguments on this, because when they appeal to the Constitution, it falls on deaf ears with me. Tina gave a great quote on this where she said, the left appeals to the Constitution the way the atheist appeals to the Bible, without any understanding or belief in the sacred nature of it. They just do it when it's convenient for their argument, and then they just as quickly ignore it when it's not. So I'm with you. I'm with you guys on that. I'm with you guys on the idea that I don't care about the left's argument on that, because I don't think it's genuine or intellectually consistent or honest. However, there's a conservative argument against Trump exporting what he's doing in D.C. to other places. And I will say this. I think that the reason why the conservative argument is coming up is because of his reference to other cities and saying, essentially alluding to the fact that D.C. is just the beginning. So, Christian, do you see any merit to the conservative argument that this is a violation of the constitutional restrictions and restraint that we put on the executive branch specifically, and the federal government more broadly?
No, I don't.
Okay, why?
Because of the last 5 years. I mean, it's unpopular. You're making it. They did it to us. We do it to them.
No.
This is the part where James Lindsay's going to come back and clip this and post this on Twitter, even though he has me blocked. Hi, James, and he'll be like, these dangerous, post-liberal reactionary fascists, just want to chuck the rule of law out the window. We were shown by the other side, because I was against all of this. I was still a libertarian in 2020. We were shown by the other side that the rule of law is a myth, and that it's the rule of men, and that when something came along like a virus with a less than 1% fatality rate by the time it was spreading all across the United States, what did the left do in response to that? A bad flu season. What did they do? They shut the entire country down. They arrested people when they went to church. They arrested people when they went to, skate parks. They arrested people when they went to the beach. We had Democratic governors that were roping off the gardening section of grocery stores.
So
by executive order.
So I get all that.
Was any of that legal? Was any of that constitutional?
Here's what I get with all of that. I get all of that, but my question is more specific. I get that the left does not particularly care about the rule of law.
What I'm trying to say.
What I'm saying is should we?
So on that point, it is an unfortunate thing. Both of these things can be true simultaneously.
Sure.
That we are in a post-constitutional age, and that it is also a bad thing that we are in a post-constitutional age. But it does not take away from the fact that we are increasingly entering into an era of power politics where it's going to be, it's not that might makes right. It's that right can never triumph over might simply by being right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good
And
way
so
to put it.
the question is not, how do we constrain power when the other side recognizes no limitations on power? The question is, how do we ensure that it's good people that are wielding power? Now, to the degree of we want to win this fight so that way we can get back to restoring the rule of law, that's absolutely essential. That's the second side of the story that sometimes I leave out when I talk about things from my perspective. But what we're in right now is effectively we're rehashing a lot of these questions that we thought were answered 200 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other side of this outcome, once this is going to be settled, right? Once, to go back to the old FACO model, like once power is adjudicated, then you can get back to setting up things, mechanisms, the rule of law, procedures and processes. But you can't do those things until power is adjudicated.
Okay, so let me clarify something. You're not saying, because we've had this conversation before about procedures and processes, and that essentially we become too dependent on procedures and processes, and we fail to recognize when they have failed to actually achieve the results we want. Granted. So you're not saying that the procedures and processes are bad. You're not saying the Constitution is bad. What you're saying is that we now find ourselves in a situation where a significant portion of the country, and maybe even an entire political party in the form of the Democratic Party, does not value the principles which make the Constitution work. And so to appeal to the Constitution, or to expect the Constitution to save us in an environment where so many people don't believe in it, is futile. And so what you're saying now is that the left demonstrated during COVID, primarily on the state level, but on the federal level to some degree as well, the left demonstrated that they don't really believe it. They will use power. And now that we have power, we have to recognize that constitutional limitations are basically going to restrain the president to our detriment. And when our guy's in power, he needs to be able to exercise, he needs to basically blur the lines of constitutionality in order to achieve positive end states, so that we can get back to a place where the very clear lines of the Constitution can be adequately appreciated and therefore enjoyed. Is that fair?
I want us to win so that way we can get to the point where we can reestablish the rule of law.
So what do you say to the argument that, okay, but if your version of winning includes you implementing the sort of policies which degraded the Constitution, it will only lead to further degrading of the Constitution. And you won't get what you want. What you will get is just a right-wing version of the authoritarian.
Well, I would totally disagree with that, because all that we're advocating for is restoring law and order in cities that don't have it.
But
if
utilizing the mechanism.
But I don't care about, again, it gets back into the whole process and procedure. I don't care about the process or procedure. I care about the outcome. I want a positive outcome.
Yeah.
I don't care what mechanisms are necessary to get to that positive outcome.
This is fundamentally
it can be depending on what you define as what the positive outcome is.
Well, no, because what you just made, I don't think you intended to, but you made an absolute statement. You said, I don't care what the processes are. I care about the end state. I care about the end state. Okay. That is an ends justify the means approach.
What it is I want people to not fear for their lives if they're living in a particular city in this country by virtue of living in a city where the Democrat, district attorney or the state attorney general or the state legislature has just decided to effectively legalize crime.
Okay, but you're not. Here's what I'm trying to get at. This is always the question here.
Here's a perfect example.
Okay, no,
perfect example
wait. Before you go into your example, I want the example to actually answer my question. Okay, my question is, I don't believe you're an ends justify the means sort of guy. I don't believe you mean we should just nuke Detroit and start over, right? Like that would solve the crime problem in Detroit. it would also murder a lot of innocent people. So let's get away with the hyperbole for a second. Here's what I'm looking for, okay? What sort of mechanisms would you be totally open to Donald Trump using that he doesn't necessarily have constitutional authority to use, but you believe would achieve the necessary end state, right? And potentially get us to a degree of maybe normalcy where we could then come back and say, it's the whole Sulla thing, right, in Rome.
Oh,
I come
but
in,
here's the
I
thing.
violate the rules, but then I set him up. Like, what would you
I
approve?
don't accept the premise of the question because everything that he can do is constitutional.
Okay,
It's
then-
just that he has not.
Then what is the constitutional mechanism? This would be so easy if people would just answer my question. What would be the constitutional mechanism you want Donald
Well, I mean,
Trump to use?
here's an easy example. He can invoke the Insurrection Act and federalize the National Guard in California and deploy them in Oakland and San Francisco and LA if necessary. Certain
And you
parts
think
of
there's
it.
you think there is sufficient justification in your own mind? You think there's sufficient justification to say San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, Compton, these cities are essentially an open insurrection at this point?
He absolutely has the authority to do that. Here's the text from the Insurrection Act. It says right here that the president, using the militia or the armed forces or both by any other means, shall take such measures that he considers necessary to suppress in any state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if it, 1, so hinders the execution of the laws of that state and of the United States within that state and any other class of people deprived of a right, privilege, immunity, or protection named in the Constitution
and
and
secured
secured
by
by law. There are numerous people right now
Yeah.
whose rights are being deprived. Their right to life, liberty, property. These are things in the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution guarantees many of these rights as well. And these rights are being trampled upon in cities that are basically blue cities that have been in largely blue states that have been run into the ground.
Okay.
And
okay.
he absolutely, the thing is that this
So
is
that's-
a crossing the Rubicon type moment, right? He's pushing the envelope. He's very much pushing the envelope in the same way that Lincoln suspending habeas corpus
During the Civil
pushes
War.
the envelope.
Yeah.
But you can also argue that was legal.
Yeah.
That is absolutely like a Rubicon type moment, obviously in a extreme exception, in this case being the Civil War. But, we talk about throughout history of notice how they're all like progressive presidents that are doing these things. Woodrow Wilson, FDR.
Yeah.
They did extreme stuff.
Yeah.
That most of it, the vast majority of it, was actually entirely legal. Now, some of the stuff they did, you could argue, was illegal.
Yeah.
And then later on, the Supreme Court kind of came in and kind of wrote a justification after the fact. But the fact of the matter is that I don't think that there's anything that Trump has to do where he's just making himself a dictator and he's just absolutely just kind of, to quote Beto O'Rourke, we're going to drive that car like we stole it. Notice how the Democrats talk about this stuff right now. That's in the context of redistricting. But he's saying like, oh, I see people all day long saying this is against the rules. And Beto O'Rourke said, F the rules, the rules don't matter. We're just going to, he literally said, we're going to drive the car like we stole it. Well, what a fantastic rallying cry to define this party that is effectively a force of civilizational entropy that masquerades as a legitimate political movement. Yeah. And so the question that you've presented to me, I don't accept the premise because everything I'm suggesting that Trump do, I think it's all legal.
Well,
I think
okay,
it's all constitutional. It's just stuff that is outside the bounds of normal political behavior.
And I see that's what I was looking for. That's what I'm looking for, right? And I think that's fair. It's the question of you're not saying that Trump should temporarily suspend the Constitution and do whatever he wants. You're saying that things like the Insurrection Act give him the authority. Now, some of it's open for interpretation, right? And no doubt people will look at it and be like, well, wait a second, nobody hasn't interpreted it this way before. And your response to that is fine. And these cities haven't been in the poor condition that they have been, and in an open rebellion the way they have been on things like ICE. You actually had a member of the Los Angeles City Council asking the chief of police, what can the LAPD do to help our undocumented members of our community avoid ICE? It's like, well, you have a city council member advocating for the open obstruction of federal immigration law. That's a crime. You can't do that. You may not have to participate in helping ICE, but you sure as heck cannot engage in open obstruction of law, open obstruction of justice. And that's what they were doing. So I think I have a better understanding of what your argument is. Here's mine, and then we'll end it with this. I absolutely think Trump should do what he's doing in D.C. I think the Christian makes a good argument for how that could theoretically be expanded into other cities. I do think, listen, I am never going to be someone that says that, well, look, the left did it, so should we, because then the left will finally realize that they don't like it. I think the left recognizes that they don't like it when we do it. But they also don't have the same appreciation, especially when I talk about left, I'm not talking about all liberals. I'm talking about woke progressive leftists, which do dominate and essentially kind of run the Democratic Party now. I'm not really interested in their protests about the Constitution because I don't think it's genuine. I do think that we shouldn't just ignore the Constitution. I do think those processes and mechanisms matter. It's one of the things that is rooted in the identity of American conservatism. It's one of the things that makes American conservatism different from a lot of forms of European conservatism. By the same token, I think Tina and Christian make really, really good points that we do have a lot of these cities that have passed beyond this idea of just dealing with typical crime, where you actually have locally elected boards which are actively engaging in again, proactive obstruction of justice with respect to the federal government's constitutionally appointed responsibilities and authorities. And so does that give President Trump the ability to utilize constitutional authority in order to clean up certain cities? You can make that argument. And most importantly, I think regardless of whether or not you can make the legal argument, there's an ever-growing portion of the population that is just fed up with what they might call half measures. They don't want to hear a procedural argument. I heard someone the other day who I respect give a purely procedural argument, and it was the same thing, right? It was like, well, if we do it, we're no better. If we do it, look, there are certain things that I don't believe conservatives should ever engage in. I don't think we should engage in open lying. I don't think we should engage in abandoning logic and truth in order to try to just exercise power for its own sake, even if we believe it's a noble end. I do think the means matter. By the same token, when you have the means to use power in order to achieve positive end states, then it is a time, I think, to be aggressive. I think it is a time to be aggressive, because there are a lot of cities that have just gotten completely out of control. And unfortunately, we have an education system and we have a lot of other culturally shaping institutions which have made it possible. And one of the things that we're seeing right now with DOGE, one of the things that we're seeing right now with certain funding being cut to organizations like USAID, is that all of a sudden, ideas that we thought were not just coming from academia, but had a certain degree of popular groundswell of support, we're realizing were manufactured using our tax dollars. And so while I do want Trump to stay within the boundaries of the Constitution, I also understand him using an aggressive interpretation. Now, does that mean I will give carte blanche to whatever the administration wants to do, provided that it maintains order? No. I believe in protecting civil liberties. But I do think things have gotten to a point where Trump exercising an appropriate amount of constitutional authority is important. I also am very hopeful that what he's about to do in D.C. will demonstrate two things. One, the left is willing to use, and we already know this, but I think it's going to be really, really identified here, political violence in order to stop making a city safer. And I'm hoping this translates into governors taking more actions in places where they can, where it doesn't require the president coming in and doing stuff, right? The governor of Tennessee could actually do a lot to quell crime in Memphis. Right? And I think that's where it needs to start. I would love to see Republican governors and Republican states, right, utilizing the authority that they have within their state constitutions to take back control of some of these cities within these red states and demonstrate that the crime problem can be solved through better policy. And that policy is not releasing people out early. That policy is looking especially at violent crime and the things that lead up to violent crime and prosecuting it rigorously, and understanding that while we may all want a system which leads to the rehabilitation and reintegration of people into our society, of course, that is a noble and laudable goal. But if it comes at the expense of law-abiding citizens constantly having to live in fear, well, then we got our priorities wrong. And we need to prioritize making communities safe for the people that are willing to contribute to safe communities, not catering to people that constantly violate the law and treating the rest of society as if we're to blame because they continue to break it. So I think Trump should continue to do what he's doing in D.C. I think he should be prepared for a big backlash and to be able to crack down on that backlash through legal and constitutional mechanisms. And I do think that I want to see more Republican governors stepping up and saying, we're going to deal with the issues in the cities and our states. And let's set an example. Let's set an example for the rest of the country. Let's send a message to blue cities that you don't have to live in a cesspool of crime due to woke ideology. By simply enforcing common sense laws, you can actually create a safer community, which encourages people to actually engage in business and educate and the arts and everything else, because that's what you get in high trust societies. But unfortunately, that is not what some of the bluest cities in our country have sought to do. So that's our opinion. Tell us what you think of yours is. Plus, we also want to do a quick reminder here. We want to thank Ground News for being the presenting sponsor of this episode. Once again, go to ground.news/MTA. Get 40% off that Vantage plan. It is a great source to be able to go and research what is going on to figure out everything you need to know, not just about what's being reported, but who it's being reported by and why. Once again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next episode.